Well, hi, my name's Andy Tidy and welcome back to another episode of Canal Hunter. This is the series when we're trying to trace the lost canal link that went from Norbury Junction on the Shropshire Union Canal all the way through to Ironbridge on the River Severn. Well, so far in this series we've reached the town of Newport, and in this episode we're heading on to the end of the Newport Branch Canal to a place called Wappenshall. This is the point where the Newport Branch Canal joined into the much older Shrewsbury Tub Boat Canal. We left the last episode in the gathering gloom at Polly's Lock, about a mile to the west of Newport, at the end of the partially restored section. From there, the canal, which was formerly abandoned in 1944, has been very much ploughed back into the farmland and its route becomes rather indistinct. Although the satellite imagery reveals traces of the line taken by the canal, there's no public right-of-way along its course. So we've jumped forwards here to the old site of the old canal bridge at Edgemond, and we'll use the drone to fly back towards Polly's Lock and to pick up where we left off. Just to the east of where I'm now standing was the Edgemond Lock and the Edgemond Wharf, but they've all now long gone. And then it's back into the fields and the sites of Bonnybank and Strinewater bridges, bridges which are remembered only by names on the maps. Well, the next couple of miles are mostly devoid of built canal remains. And for some reason, the farms seem to have gone out of their way to obliterate the course of the old canal track. So we'll mostly be relying on the drone to fly over and give an impression of the terrain, and we'll just focus when we know there's something to be found. To the west of here, it's all back into open fields, and ultimately we pick up the line of the canal which forms an old field boundary. Look, I won't bore you with mile after mile of empty fields saying, look, there used to be a canal down there. I'll just fill some highlights and give you an idea of the land we're covering. Anyway, as you might have gathered, where I'm standing is rather a busy road and rather noisy. So I think what we'll do is we'll hop on to our next landmark and I'll catch up with the story there. See you in a second. The sites of the lost farm access bridges come thick and fast as we approach the next landmark in an otherwise barren environment. Buttery Farm. This place used to boast a boathouse on the canal and a curious split bridge. One side of it was reserved for vehicles, the other for horses as they moved over from the towpath on one side of the canal to the other. Of course, this is all long gone and is now just a pile of rubble in the corner of a field. This massively underpopulated area is known as the Weald Moors, or the Wild Moors in other words, from a time when the area was wild, uncultivated land. This was a triangle of low boggy ground with just a few settlements built on the higher bits. They were known as the Eyes, Kinnersley, Butterley, Adney. Till 250 years ago, the whole area was prone to winter flooding, and the Eyes were surrounded with water. But then along came the first Duke of Sutherland, and he set about draining the area. He built dykes, otherwise known locally as strines, and as he did this, he brought hundreds of acres into arable production. So this relatively recent reclamation explains the absence of population and the complexity of gaining access to the canal track in this area. Now, access is very difficult around here, and an OS map is a great help to distinguish between public footpaths and private farm tracks. But Buttery Farm is your landmark, and it could be used to access our next canal structure, the Kinnersley Aqueduct, which is right there behind me. Yeah, in keeping with the rest of this canal, that aqueduct that's right behind me actually isn't there anymore, but there's a bit of a story attached to that. But before I get onto that, getting here, drive to Kinnersley Village and then you walk down Kinnersley Drive. This was the old way that the Duke of Sutherland built to access his Lilleshall estate. It's not a railway track, although it feels very much like it. It's right there behind me. This Kinnersley Drive went underneath the Kinnersley Aqueduct, which was a rather magnificent piece of engineering. However, it was reputedly blown up by the army to give better access to the farmland beyond. That said, if you look closely into the local Strine, the stream beside me, you can still see the remains of the dress stone which represented the abutments, also a big pile of rubble. Luckily, we are left with a good collection of old photos of what this aqueduct used to look like. The Newport Branch Canal sat on top of the embankment up there and crossed across this brook and continued onto the embankment over there. If we look down into the water level of the brook, you can see along the far wall there are some remains of the edge of the aqueduct, the dressed stone blocks which are really out of keeping for the middle of nowhere. Let's go a bit closer and see if we can see those. As well as the residual foundations, you've got some of these old blocks that have been left by the roadside, and if you look closely you can tell in here there's the dressing marks from the axes that used to chop these and turn them into rectangular blocks. The junction to the Humber branch also lay in these woods. This was a short 1 mile branch canal which went off to the south, and then it connected to a 3 mile tramway leading into the Duke of Sutherland's mines and the lodge furnace at Donington Wood. A much more extensive canal was planned all the way to Lilleshall, which would have included 7 locks, but the branch as far as Lubstree Wharf is all that was actually built. This little arm with its connecting tramway was busy carrying limestone out of the Lilleshall quarry and iron ore from Ellesmere Port into the lodge furnace. In effect, this was a shortcut into the Donington Wood Canal, which we're going to explore later on in this series. Interestingly, Tony Clayton, a canal enthusiast, visited the area in the 1970s, and he discovered the remains of a number of the old tugboats lying at Lubstree Wharf, so I'll pop up the photos of those. These days, most of the Humber branch is gone, save a few hundred yards, which are in water and will serve as a bit of a water feature, including Lubstree Wharf building and a farm access bridge. I guess that's more than you'd normally expect to see on the ground in this area. From here, the canal continued on westwards towards the village of Preston on the Weald, before locking onto the hamlet of Wappenshall in the shadow of the mighty Wrekin Hill. Along the way, it crossed the site of several old farm access bridges, obviously all lost, but we'll jump ahead to Preston and take it from there. Well, after those miles and miles of emptiness, we finally arrive at Wappenshall Junction, which is right behind me. And I have to say, this does come as something of a breath of fresh air. After all of those bridges which I've told you were collapsed, an aqueduct which isn't there anymore, and locks which are buried inside the mud, finally we have a living element of the old Newport Branch Canal. This junction was created by joining the Newport Branch Canal as it met the established 1797 Shrewsbury Tub Boat Canal, which carried mainly coal. Its cluster of warehouses were built in the 1830s, and it's believed that Telford may have actually designed the smaller one. It certainly looks very similar to the other warehouses you see up and down the Shropshire Union Canal. Now, when I first visited Wappenshall 15 years ago, a few tentative steps have been made towards repurposing the buildings. But a lot has happened in the intervening years. And that explains the reason for the high-vis jackets and the hat. This is an active building site, and they are rebuilding the warehouse for use as an exhibition centre. The basin behind me has been dug out and rewatered, and there are big plans for expanding this site. So massive change here at Wappenshall, and well worth a visit when you can actually access it through all the protective fencing. Thankfully, the work party here today were very happy to let me visit and come and have a look at it from this side of the canal. Telford and Wrekin Council bought the site in 2009, and they granted the Canal Trust a 125-year lease over the East Basin and also the buildings. Planning permissions were then sought, and work actually started in 2018. And it continues weekly, including the day that I'm here. So deep in the heart of Shropshire, there is this little hidden gem, a restored section of the Newport Branch Canal, and it will act as something of a bridgehead to more restoration work on this canal. So I end this episode on something of a high note. We've come all the way from Norbury, we've come through Newport and across the Wealds, and now finally we're here at Wappenshall. From here we have actually reached the junction with the tubboat canals, but that, as they say, is all for another day. For now, that's the end of this episode of Canal Hunter. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you again soon. Cheerio.